Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything you believe to be freedom might in fact be a trap. You speak, you act, you choose, and it feels like your life belongs to you. But what if each so-called free thought was quietly guided by someone else, as if you were an actor in a play where the script was never written by you? Freedom is a word that sounds beautiful, almost like a melody you have known since childhood. But what if that melody is played on someone else's instrument and in someone else's rhythm? We are taught that freedom means the ability to say whatever we think. Yet if someone hidden decides what may be said and what must remain unspoken, then freedom is no longer flight, but a cage with glass walls. You look around, and it seems open, limitless. But take one step beyond the permitted line, and you hit an invisible wall. To control words is to control thought. To control thought is to control reality itself. Look closely at the world. People argue about politics, about religion, about who is right and who is wrong. But almost no one dares to ask the deeper question: who created the rules of this game? Who drew the boundaries we are forced to live inside? We are born nameless, without a flag, without a passport. Yet the moment we take our first breath, the system begins to brand us. A name, a nationality, a role, a religion. The ink is invisible, but the chains are real. By the time we learn to speak, we have already been told who we are. By the time we learn to think, the walls of identity are already built around us. Now let me ask you something. If everything you call your identity was suddenly stripped away, your job, your citizenship, your beliefs, what would remain? What would still be you? Think about it and leave your answer in the comments. I really want to know how you see yourself beyond all the labels, because here lies the secret. The danger is not the label itself, but the moment we confuse the label with the self. When you say, "I am my job, I am my race, I am my religion," you hand the keys of perception to the outside world. You let someone else tell you what you are. And when you forget what you could be, you shrink into a role. And a role is easy to control. This is why division exists. Nations against nations, groups against groups, people arguing endlessly over colors of uniforms, while the unseen warden locks the gate. And yet, there is another way. A way to step outside the play, outside the cage, outside the illusion. If this beginning made you think, stay with me. Because in the next part, we will go deeper into the hidden machinery of control that most never notice. And if you want to keep exploring these questions with me, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Think about this for a moment. The strongest prison is not built of stone or steel. It is built of thoughts, beliefs, and invisible rules. A prisoner who sees the bars knows he is trapped. But a prisoner who sees no bars may never even try to escape. That is the brilliance of control. Keep people inside boundaries so subtle that they believe those boundaries are freedom. When you say, "I can speak, but only if I stay polite," you are not free. When you say, "I can question, but only if I never touch certain topics," you are not free. That is not freedom of speech. It is permission of speech. And permission is always granted by an authority that believes it has the right to decide. Step by step, year by year, the space for honest words grows smaller, until one day, silence feels normal. This is what political correctness truly is: a mask, a filter, a shrinking circle of what may be spoken. And once the circle shrinks enough, it begins to suffocate the very idea of freedom. Because words are not just sounds, words are the tools of thought. Control words, and you control how people think. Control thought, and you control what they believe reality to be. So here is the paradox. Humanity chained not by weapons, but by invisible walls of language and law. And the question you must ask yourself is simple. Who decides where those walls stand? Who writes the script of what may be said and what must never be spoken? Now pause for a second and look at your own life. Have you ever wanted to say something, but stopped yourself, not because you did not believe it, but because you feared how others would react? If yes, write in the comments how it felt. Was it relief, or was it like swallowing your own voice? Your answer might surprise you. The system knows this very well. That is why it builds prisons of perception. It tells you who you are, what you can be, and what you should never even imagine. And if you accept the label as your true identity, then you hand over your power willingly. You are no longer infinite awareness. You are just a worker, or a citizen, or a believer in one single box. And boxes are easy to stack, easy to separate, easy to control. This is why rulers throughout history have always divided people into categories. Divide and rule. Make people forget their unity, and they will fight to protect illusions. One nation against another. One religion against another. One party against another. All the while, the hidden architects smile, because the fighting itself keeps the prison strong. But what happens when people remember that they are not labels, not costumes, not roles? When people realize that awareness cannot be divided, cannot be bribed, cannot be owned, the prison begins to crack. And that is the very thing the system fears most. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will look at how this invisible prison was built into the very tools we use every day. The internet, the platforms, the feeds we scroll. What you think is connection may in truth be the most powerful cage ever invented. And if this second part made sense to you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more than you imagine. The internet was sold to us as liberation, a place where anyone could speak, connect, and share ideas without limits. It looked like the greatest gift of the modern world, a vast digital commons where no voice would be silenced. At least, that is what we were told. But if you follow the roots of this story, you find they lead not to freedom, but to laboratories, military programs, and intelligence agencies. The early seeds of the internet were not planted by dreamers of free speech. They were planted by networks like DARPA, by intelligence organizations, by shadowy programs that shaped the companies we now call tech giants. Search engines, social media, video platforms, all began with ties to power that most of us never even suspected. At first, the mask was kind. Search engines promised unlimited knowledge. Social networks promised connection. Video platforms promised a voice for everyone. We fell in love with the promise. And in doing so, we walked willingly into the net. The trap was baited with hope. And once dependency was complete, the rules began to change. Today, a handful of corporations sit like unelected kings over the flow of global information. Google decides what rises to the top of your search. Social platforms choose which voices are amplified and which vanish into silence. Videos disappear overnight. Channels are erased. Accounts are shadow banned without explanation. This is not censorship in the old sense, where government seized printing presses. It is something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Algorithmic invisibility. You still post, you still speak, but your words vanish into a digital void. You are silenced not by force, but by absence. You are free to talk, yes, but only to yourself. And so the illusion of freedom survives, while true freedom dies. Billions believe they are free because the cage has no visible bars. But when the very architecture of perception is owned, freedom is an illusion. In past ages, emperors controlled nations. Today, a few executives in Silicon Valley hold power greater than any emperor. Ask yourself, who decides what is hate speech, what is fake news, what history remains, and what is erased? It is not you. It is not me. It is a concentration of power so extreme that the beliefs of billions are shaped by a few invisible policies. Now let me ask you this. Do you remember the first time you noticed that your feed, your search, your platform was hiding something from you? Did it feel like a glitch, or did it feel like someone had already chosen what you were allowed to see? Share that moment in the comments, because it is stories like yours that show others they are not alone. This is why control has moved from armies and thrones into code and servers. Algorithms decide reality for billions. The prison no longer silences you with violence. It convinces you that your silence is your own choice. That is the perfection of control. But the question remains, if these companies shape what we know, who shapes them? Who funds them? Who directs them? Who writes the code that now writes our perception? Follow that trail, and you may see the true architects behind the digital cage. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will uncover the pyramid of power that stands above governments and leaders, a pyramid where the few hold the strings of the many. And if this part opened your eyes even a little, give the video a like so more people can step into the light with us. We are taught to believe that presidents, parliaments, and prime ministers hold the highest authority. They stand on stages, sign laws, shake hands, and smile for cameras. We are told they are the architects of society. But what if that is only theater? What if the real directors of the play stand in the shadows, unseen by the audience? Picture power as a pyramid. At the very top, less than 1% hold the true strings. Beneath them lies a layer of enforcers, military, police, intelligence services. And at the base is the rest of humanity, billions of people who believe that by voting, by protesting, by choosing between two sides, they are shaping their future. But the truth is different. The outcome of the play was scripted long before the curtain rose. This is not new. History repeats this pattern. In Rome, senators paraded in public while hidden cults held the real influence. Today, leaders debate on television while financiers, corporations, and networks of secrecy shape the real agenda. The stage changes. The script remains the same. Banks fund campaigns. Corporations write laws. Intelligence agencies direct policy. Behind every politician stands a lobbyist with a contract, a financier with a ledger, or an operative with a secret file. These are the true rulers, and their reach extends beyond borders. Even money itself is part of the trap. Central banks create debt from nothing. Governments borrow not for the people, but for their masters. Debt becomes endless, and endless debt means endless control. Nations collapse while the pyramid thrives. The middle of the pyramid is crucial. Soldiers, officers, workers, ordinary citizens who enforce the system because they believe it protects stability. Yet in truth, the stability they serve is not for their families, but for the architects of control. One day, they may realize their children inherit the same chains. Until then, the show continues. Elections become theater. Left against right, red against blue, people argue with passion, anger, even hatred, believing it matters. But behind both parties stand the same funders, the same networks. The actors change. The script does not. That is why promises made during campaigns vanish once power is gained. Wars begin that no one asked for. Laws pass that no one wanted. Surveillance expands, freedoms shrink, and yet people still believe the next actor might finally change the play. This is what some call the Hunger Games society, a world of engineered scarcity for the many, luxury for the few, and a militarized system to enforce the order. You see it already. The middle class is hollowed out. Homelessness grows. Billionaires multiply. Ordinary workers are punished with austerity. This is not failure. This is design. And here is the great lie. Power is not in the office you see. It is in the unseen agreements, the closed doors, the invisible networks. Citizens cheer for their party, argue for their leader, all the while serving a script written far above. So the deeper question rises. If politicians are masks, who writes the lines they speak? Which families, which networks, which architects of shadow sit at the top of the pyramid? Stay with me, because in the next part, we will move beyond politics and money into something even older, a layer of control that does not just influence leaders, but shapes human perception itself. And if this opened your eyes a little, let me know with a like. It helps this message reach those still asleep. Up to now, we have followed the visible layers of control, labels that shrink us, platforms that silence us, a pyramid of money and power. But there is another layer, older and far stranger, a layer that does not just influence politics, but shapes human perception itself. Across cultures and centuries, there are stories of hidden rulers. The Gnostics called them archons. Islamic tradition named them jinn. Christianity spoke of demons. Indigenous shamans sang about shadow beings. Different names, same pattern. An intuition that the visible world sits on top of a deeper, unseen reality. Science gives us a clue. The light our eyes perceive is a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. Most of the universe is invisible to our senses. If entities could exist on those unseen frequencies, they would be effectively invisible to us, yet still able to interact. We might call their influence coincidence, madness, or miracle. David Icke frames this not as mere mythology, but as a functional model. These non-human intelligences feed on certain states: fear, chaos, hatred, despair. They are, in his view, energy parasites, not only metaphorically, but in a real energetic sense. The more a society is kept anxious, outraged, fragmented, and fearful, the richer the harvest becomes. Look around. Perpetual crises, rituals of violence, spectacles designed to shock and divide. These are the harvest festivals of a system that feeds on our low vibrations. And the elites who stand at the top of the pyramid are not merely political players. They are conduits, practitioners, or at least willing collaborators in amplifying that harvest. Centuries of ritual, bloodline continuity, and ceremonies in sacred locations. These are not just pageantry. In this frame, ritual is a technology. Repeated patterns at precise times and places thin the membrane between frequencies. Over time, repetition makes the threshold porous. What looks like theater to the public can function as a working ritual to the initiated. Have you ever noticed how often the same symbols, numbers, and motifs appear in the ceremonies of power, from royal coronations to state funerals, from logos to public art? It is not random. It is code. For the uninitiated, it is decoration. For the initiated, it is protocol. Pause for a moment. What is one symbol you have seen repeatedly in government buildings, media logos, or public events that made you curious? Drop it in the comments. Others might see it too and begin to connect the dots. Because secrecy is part of the mechanism. Ritual's power requires two things: repeated performance and an audience that does not decode it. If everyone knows the code, the hidden function collapses into mere spectacle. That is why symbols are both public and secret, visible to the eye, but unreadable to the mind unless you know their grammar. This is why power has always sought to break us into fragments, divide and rule. Keep people distracted by their labels, their factions, their outrage, and they will not notice the architecture of the stage they stand on. But here is the key. Awareness dissolves secrecy. Translate a symbol, trace a ritual's lineage, show the repeated pattern, and the mystique begins to break. Knowledge converts ritual from an occult technique into a cultural artifact, and artifacts can be repurposed or retired. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will explore how these rituals, symbols, and bloodlines work together as a technology of control, and how knowing their grammar gives us the first real weapon of freedom. And if this part sparked a thought, like the video, so it can reach others still locked inside the show, symbols are the grammar of hidden power. They are not random decorations. They are lines of code written into our visible world. To the untrained eye, a crown is just a crown. A scepter is just a stick. A number is just a number. But to those who know the code, each object, color, and gesture is a signal, a protocol, a tool. Ritual works like a kind of technology. Repeat an act at a precise time and place, and it begins to shape the energy of a moment. Do it over years, over generations, and you shape the culture itself. Coronations, inaugurations, national anthems, even sports events, all can function as tuning forks for collective emotion. They do not just honor the past, they tune the present. Think of a ritual like an acoustic chamber. One voice alone is weak. 1,000 voices in the same place, chanting the same words, year after year, can vibrate a culture. For the public, it is spectacle. For the initiated, it is engineering. Royal ceremonies are ancient and deliberate. The procession routes pass through sites layered with meaning. The gestures, the colors, the numbers are chosen with care. Every detail resonates with an older tradition. This is why symbolism repeats across empires and dynasties. Sigils, numbers, animal motifs, they echo from one power center to the next. Repetition breeds reliability. If a ritual is meant to alter a pattern, whether of authority, perception, or energy, then repetition in the right place becomes the laboratory method. Bloodlines add another layer. In this frame, families are not just genealogies, they are vessels of continuity. If a ritual depends on subtle accumulated effects, then preserving lineage ensures the protocol persists intact. This is why dynasties intermarry, why ancestry is sacralized. Blue blood talk is not vanity, it is continuity language. And yet, secrecy is vital. For a ritual to rearrange mass perception, it needs two things: repetition and an audience that does not decode it. If everyone knew the code, the hidden function would collapse into theater. So rituals are at once public and secret, visible to the eye but unreadable to the mind unless you have been trained. Now pause. Have you ever attended a public ceremony, a graduation, a military parade, a national celebration, and felt a strange charge, like the atmosphere itself had changed? Write in the comments what it felt like: calm, uplifting, or unsettling. Your answers might help others see these events with new eyes. The result of this hidden grammar is paradoxical transparency. The elite tell us what they are doing in plain sight, while relying on our ignorance to maintain effect. And yet, awareness is the demolition tool. Translate the symbol, trace the ritual's lineage, show the repeated pattern, and the mystique begins to break. Collective art, shared practices of joy, communal acts of remembrance can retune a culture's frequency. If a narrow, fear-based ritual lowers vibration, broad-based practices that amplify empathy, creativity, and reason raise it the other way. In other words, counter-rituals are possible. Modern systems already co-opt the language of ritual. Corporations stage product launches like coronations. Political campaigns script rallies like liturgies. Social media memes spread as modern amulets. The old and the new converge. Where once ritual required temples and masked priests, now it requires billboards, viral hashtags, and televised spectacles. The technology changes, the method remains. Stay with me. Because in the next part, we will move to the synthesis, how all these layers, from labels to algorithms to rituals, form one architecture of control, and how that architecture can be broken. And if this part gave you a new way to see, give it a like so it can find others who are ready to look. Step back for a moment and see the pattern. Labels that shrink us, platforms that silence us, pyramids of money that script politics, unseen entities that feed on fear, rituals that tune whole nations. At first, these look like separate stories, but together they form a single architecture, a system designed not to cage your body, but to capture your perception. Perception is the true battlefield. Whoever engineers what you see, hear, and feel, engineers what you believe to be real. Feed people division, fear, and confusion, and they will act as if the world is only those things. Salt it with ritual, color it with spectacle, and billions move like pieces on a board. This is why censorship matters less as force and more as habit. It is not about arresting every dissenter. It is about creating an environment where people silence themselves, where they no longer ask dangerous questions because the thought never crosses their mind. That is control at its peak. The brilliance of this system is that it always offers bait: freedom, safety, convenience, connection. The trap is always wrapped in hope. First, you are promised liberation. Then, you are promised protection. Finally, you are handed control. And by then, most people accept it willingly. Look at history. Empires once ruled by armies, then by kings, then by governments. Today, they rule by code and narrative. The throne has been replaced by the algorithm. The army has been replaced by perception management. But the goal remains the same: keep the many divided and the few in control. Now think about your own life. How much of what you believe to be true did you discover on your own, and how much was given to you by media, by school, by platforms that decide what rises and what disappears? Be honest with yourself, and if you want, share in the comments one belief you once held strongly, but later discovered was not true. Your story might help someone else question theirs, because questioning is the first crack in the wall. Once you see that perception can be engineered, you can no longer unsee it. You start noticing the patterns, the recycled symbols, the staged crises, the predictable outrage. And once the mechanism is visible, the mystery dissolves. Exposure breaks secrecy. That is why the system fears awareness more than protest. Protest can be absorbed, managed, redirected. Awareness cannot. Awareness spreads silently, like fire. Once enough people remember they are more than their labels, more than their feeds, more than their roles, the control begins to fail. Stay with me. Because in the next part, we will go deeper into the most important step: how to resist this architecture, not with anger or outrage, but with frequency, with awareness, with new forms of building. And if this part connected with you, help it connect with others by liking the video. When you first see the architecture of control, It can feel overwhelming, like standing in a maze that stretches forever. But here is the secret the system hides. Its power depends on your agreement, on your attention, on your energy. Without your consent, even silent consent, it collapses. Control is not destiny. Perception is a habit, and habits can be broken. This is not just a slogan, it is the key. Awareness is not only diagnostic, it is liberating. Once you see the pattern, you begin to step outside it. You start to choose what you feed with your attention and what you refuse to feed. And that choice starves the harvest. The system survives on reactive emotion. Outrage amplifies reach. Fear lowers frequency. Hatred locks you into a narrow frame. When you stay steady, when you cultivate clarity, when you choose what to amplify, you become a bad source of food for the architecture of control. This is why so many tactics are built to bait you. Endless crises, endless scandals, endless triggers designed to pull you back down. The second step is to build alternate structures. If platforms can centralize perception, we can decentralize it. Support local media that values truth. Create community spaces where complexity is honored, not flattened. Seek out conversations that go beyond the official feed. The system is strong because people outsource their reality. Take it back. The third step is identity. Labels can be useful, but do not mistake them for the self. Hold who you are lightly. Recognize your shared humanity before your politics. When enough people center awareness rather than fractured labels, the divisive levers the system uses begin to fail. Now pause for a moment and think about your own attention. What was the last headline, post, or video that triggered you into anger or despair? How long did it hold your focus? Did it build you up or drain you? Write about it in the comments. Seeing your own patterns is the first act of freedom. The fourth step is ritual. Rituals are powerful because they gather people in shared states. Create new rituals of art, learning, and communal repair. They do not have to be religious or formal. They can be weekly gatherings, creative projects, shared meals, acts that lift, connect, and raise the baseline frequency instead of lowering it. Counter rituals are possible. This may sound small, but it is practical work. Every shift of attention, every act of creation, every refusal to be baited is a piece of the architecture falling away. Millions of small shifts become a tide, and tides are stronger than walls. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will bring these strands together. How to see the prison, how to step through the open door, and how to begin rebuilding perception together. If this part gave you something real to work with, like the video so it can reach others who are ready to step outside. We began with labels that shrink us. We saw how platforms silence us, how pyramids script politics, how rituals code reality. And now the path bends toward the most important truth of all. The prison door is not locked. It was built with stories, and stories can be rewritten. The system survives because people believe its walls are solid, but walls made of perception dissolve the moment perception changes. When enough people refuse to feed the machine with fear, anger, and division, the harvest collapses. That is why rulers always push for conflict, always push for crisis. Because without your attention, they cannot exist. Awareness is the demolition tool. Once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you decode the symbols, you cannot forget them. Once you trace the money, the politics, the rituals, the algorithms, you cannot pretend you do not know. Knowledge alone is not enough, but it is the scalpel that begins the surgery. Then comes courage, to act as yourself without apology, to stop hiding your thoughts behind masks of fear, to speak even when people may call you crazy. Because true freedom begins the moment you no longer trade your voice for approval. That is why the system works so hard to shame and isolate those who step outside. Shame is the cage. Courage is the key. Now think about your own life. Is there one place where you still censor yourself? One subject you never speak of? One truth you hold but are afraid to show? Imagine how different your life would feel if you let go of that fear. Write in the comments what that would be. Or if you prefer, write what stops you. You may find others feel the same. The final step is creation. The prison is dismantled not only by breaking old patterns, but by building new ones. Create art. Create spaces for conversation. Create acts of kindness that raise the frequency of those around you. The architecture of control feeds on despair. Creation is the antidote. And here is the promise. You are not just a role, not just a citizen, not just a worker. You are awareness without limit. That awareness existed before your name and will remain after your last breath. It cannot be bribed. It cannot be divided. It cannot be owned. And when people remember this, the game ends. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will turn from demolition to rebuilding. How to reclaim perception together, not just as individuals, but as communities. And if this part spoke to you, like the video, so it can find others ready to walk through the open door. When the old walls begin to fall, the question is always the same. What comes next? Because tearing down illusion is only half the work. The other half is building something new, something that cannot be hijacked so easily, something rooted in awareness instead of control. First comes the reclaiming of perception. We must learn to see not only with the eyes, but with the mind, to question every pattern, every headline, every symbol, not with paranoia, but with clarity. When you see how narratives are built, they lose their power over you. They become transparent. Second comes the rebuilding of community. The system thrives on division. Nations against nations, groups against groups, identities against identities. The antidote is unity that does not erase difference, but transcends it. Spaces where people connect beyond politics, beyond labels, beyond the cages they were given. Community becomes the shield against manipulation. Third comes the reprogramming of ritual. If elites use ceremony to tune culture downward, we can create counter-rituals that tune it upward. Gatherings that celebrate creativity, beauty, and joy. Collective acts of kindness, music, art, and remembrance. These may sound small, but they ripple outward in ways the system cannot predict and cannot control. Fourth comes the creation of new structures, platforms that do not censor, forums that do not divide, economies that do not enslave. Decentralized, transparent, built by people who remember their awareness rather than forget it. Technology can be a prison, but it can also be a bridge if we choose to design it differently. Now let me ask you, imagine one small thing in your daily life that you could change to step outside the system's rhythm. What would it be? Turning off the feed for 1 hour, starting a conversation in real life, creating instead of consuming. Write it in the comments. Your answer may inspire someone else to take their first step. And remember this, the prison was always built with consent. The moment enough people withdraw that consent, the illusion cracks. That is why every small act matters. Because billions of small acts together become unstoppable. Stay with me. Because in the next part, we will uncover the final synthesis, how awareness spreads, how the architecture crumbles, and how the future can be reclaimed. And if you feel the spark, like this video, so it can travel further and reach those who are still inside the maze. Every system of control in history has carried the same weakness. It depends on belief. The moment belief dissolves, the system collapses. Kings ruled by divine right only as long as people accepted the story. Governments ruled by law only as long as people agreed to obey. And today, algorithms rule by perception only as long as people trust what they see on the screen. This is the turning tide. Awareness spreads not like fire from one spark, but like light seeping through cracks. One person questions a headline, another decodes a symbol, another notices the algorithm's hand, and soon the cracks meet. What was once invisible becomes visible, and once visible, it can no longer control in the same way. That is why so much effort is spent to ridicule, to shame, to silence those who see differently. If the crowd laughs at you, fewer will follow you. If the system calls you mad, others will stay away. But truth has a strange persistence. Once planted, it grows in silence until it is undeniable. And here is the secret. You do not need to convince everyone. You only need enough people to shift perception. Once the tide turns, the architecture loses balance. The pyramid shakes. The enforcers at the middle begin to question why they serve a system that chains their own children. The illusion of stability cracks. Pause here and ask yourself, what was the first crack for you? The moment when you realized something was not as it seemed. Was it a news story that did not add up? A symbol that felt wrong? A promise broken too many times? Write it in the comments. Your story may be the spark for someone else. The controllers know this moment is coming. That is why distraction multiplies. More crises, more outrage, more noise. If you are always reacting, you never notice the tide beneath the surface. But when you step back, when you refuse to be baited, you see the pattern clearly. And clarity is contagious. This is how empires end, not with a single battle, but with millions of quiet refusals. Millions of people stepping out of the script at the same time. Millions choosing to create instead of consume, to question instead of obey, to connect instead of divide. The tide rises, and the pyramid cannot hold. Stay with me, because in the final part, we will bring it all together, the end of the old play and the beginning of something new. And if this part reminded you of your own first crack, give the video a like so more people can join the tide. We began this journey with a question. Who controls reality? We followed the threads, labels that shrink us, platforms that silence us, pyramids that script politics, unseen forces that feed on fear, rituals that tune culture. Piece by piece, the architecture revealed itself. And yet here is the final truth. Control was always a story, and stories can be rewritten. The old story says you are small, that you are your job, your nation, your label, that you must obey the script written for you, that the world is dangerous and only their guidance keeps you safe, that freedom is too risky, too chaotic, too much for you to handle. The new story says you are awareness without limit, that your labels are costumes, not cages, that the system cannot own you unless you agree to wear its chains, that unity is stronger than division, creation stronger than fear, clarity stronger than deception. The prison door was never welded shut. It was kept closed with belief. And the moment you see that, the lock disappears. You walk through, and on the other side you find countless others doing the same. That is how the tide becomes unstoppable. So what comes next? Rebuilding. Creating new structures that reflect truth instead of illusion. media that informs instead of manipulates, communities that connect instead of divide, rituals that raise frequency instead of lowering it. These things are not dreams. They begin the moment you choose them. Now I want to ask you one final question. If you could plant one seed for the future, something small but real, what would it be? A project, a habit, a message, a ritual of your own. Share it in the comments. Together, the seeds become a forest. Remember this, the most radical act is simple: to look clearly, to refuse manipulation, to act from a higher place. When enough people live that way, reality bends, the game ends, and the story begins again, written by us, not for us. If this journey spoke to you, stay with us. Subscribe for what comes next. Like this video so it can reach those who are still searching for the open door. The story is not finished. It is only beginning, and you are one of the authors.